Um, Thank you everyone for making the time here. We are excited to have two speakers today. But first, just to give you some background on the conference series, we have 4 learning journeys, and this is the second one. The conference aims to advance the understanding and practice of citizen participation, civic engagement, and collaborative governance. And if you're interested in some of the learning journeys after this, please look out for it in your emails. We will send you follow-ups.
I will retire there, or it depends.
We're hearing some background to that. But today we are very pleased to have Claudia Chwalisz, the founder of a Paris-based international research institute called DemocracyNext, and also Swarnalakshmi Ravi, the former National Prime Minister of India's Neighborhood Children's Parliament. And for now, actually, instead of reading their bios, I would like to invite them to self-introduce. Claudia, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Justin. And thanks also to the Institute of Policy Studies and the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities and the Singapore Totalizer Board for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. So my name is Claudia Chwalisz. I'm the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext, which is a global platform for democratic innovation. And I'll introduce that a little bit more in my presentation later. But just to give you some context of who I am, I've been working on democratic innovation for the past 12, 13 years or so in different guises. And most recently, before founding DemocracyNext, I was at the OECD, where I established and then was leading the area of work around innovative citizen participation and the future of democracy. So the through line of a lot of my work has been looking at what are meaningful ways in which we can give people a say in shaping decisions that are affecting their lives. So yeah, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Claudia. Can I invite Swarna to say a bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for Policy Institute Studies and Lee Kuan Yew Innovative Center for having us here. A very good evening to everyone. I'm Swarnalakshmi, and I currently work in an organization called PRATYeK, which means everyone. And through this organization, I support children's parliaments at the zonal level, which incorporates 6 states. And I have completed my international relations and global governance. And previously, I have had the opportunity to serve for the Children's Parliament for the past 13 years. I'm now 25 years, and I have had the opportunity of also speaking at the addressing at the United Nations for about 4 times on various occasions. First was on the Commission on the Status of Women, its 57th session, and the second time was on advocating for the Sustainable Development Goals, and third time is also for lobbying on inclusive education and contributing to the draft of the SDGs, and then finally on engaging in the process called Universal Periodic Review, participating in its pre-sessions by lobbying with the ambassadors. And so yeah, that's about me. And currently I'm happy that my work is also a little bit based on these children's parliaments and sociocracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Swarna. And we also have discussants here with us who will introduce themselves later. We have Carol Soon, my colleague from IPS, and Lin Xiaoling from the Singapore Children's Society, and a few other special guests, which we will reveal later. So what will happen if you noticed that our usual chat function is not on? That's because Swarna is visually impaired, and if you type into the chat function, the computer reads it out to her, so it's distracting for her. So for this learning journey, I would like to invite people who want to ask a question or comment later on in the Q&A session to raise your hands, and then I will invite you to verbally ask your question. So without further ado, can Claudia, you have the stage. Take us through your presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Justin. Let me just open up my slides here. There we go. Hopefully you can see those. Oh, okay. So I'm going to give you a bit of a big picture overview and introduction to this idea of citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy a little bit more broadly. So I use citizens' assemblies as a little bit of a shorthand to refer to kind of other kinds of deliberative processes as well. But first to introduce a little bit DemocracyNext, which is the organization that I run. We are a global platform for democratic innovation, and we serve as both this knowledge hub as well as an action lab for advancing the ideas of deliberative assemblies that embody these two key principles of deliberation. So meaning that collectively weighing shared evidence with the goal of coming to shared decisions off of the back of that, and sortition, which is a very ancient practice of randomly selecting decision makers. Our mission is to try and shift who has power and how we take decisions together. That's both in government, but also in other organizations of daily life. So we've also done some work with museums. We're in conversation with universities, as well as corporations and other kinds of organizations that could be using these ideas of deliberative assemblies to change their governance and their decision-making processes. And the kind of role that we play in the field. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth after I've given an overview of citizens' assemblies, but just so you have a rough sense of for the context, revolves around these 3 I's of infrastructure, institutions, and innovations. So I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. I thought before kind of going into citizens' assemblies in particular, it was useful to give a little bit of a distinction about what are these main differences between deliberative democracy and participatory democracy, because I think in the kind of wider field of people interested in democratic innovation, there's maybe more of a deeper practice and awareness of participatory approaches. And in many ways, they're quite distinct to what I'll be talking about. And that's not to say one is kind of better or worse or anything like that. That's not the value judgment here. It's more just to say that they're different. And so to understand what that means. So one of the key differences refers to the number of people involved. So in deliberative democracy, there's usually more of an intention of bringing together smaller but broadly representative groups of people, aiming to create the conditions for depth of deliberation to be possible. Whereas on the other hand, with participatory democracy, the aim is rather to engage with large numbers of people, ideally everyone affected by a particular decision, though that's rarely ever the case, if ever, but that the aim and the goal is really to try and achieve that breadth of participation. The second key difference refers then to the type of participation. So deliberation is something that requires a lot more time. It requires that the participants are well informed to be able to consider many different perspectives and to arrive at a public judgment. And I would actually add a word that's missing there and emphasize a collective public judgment. So it's not just an aggregation of individual people's views that happens. Whereas in participatory processes, there's more people who are involved, and it's more the aim is usually more to get that general sense of public opinion, people's experiences, and to have that breadth of those, but then the depth tends to be a lot more shallow in terms of the level of engagement. And then how people are selected and how they come to kind of be at the table and be participating. With deliberative democracy, sortition is really a key principle. So this idea of combining random selection with stratification, which is just a technical term to mean that there's a process involved to ensure that the group ends up being broadly representative of the community concerned. Whereas with participatory democracy, there can be different kinds of methods actually for getting people involved. Quite often there's self-selected participation when processes are kind of open and anyone can participate. Sometimes there's more targeted recruitment of specific groups that take place. And so why there's a kind of complementarity is that while there's often a very good intention, I think, with processes being open, we now also have a lot of research for many years of these kinds of practices taking place, that the people who tend to participate are usually very much not representative of the wider community, and certain demographics disproportionately participate, which in some ways ends up amplifying some of the inequalities that I think are behind the intentions that someone wants to to solve by having a participatory process in the first place. So quite often I would say that these kinds of deliberative and participatory practices can be complementary, and I'm going to really zoom in on deliberative democracy here. So rather than starting with a kind of definition or anything like that, I wanted to start with a really short video that will give you a little bit of an insight through seeing one of the kind of most well-known citizens' assemblies in action.
There is something going on in the world right now. There is a hunger across the globe in political systems to get citizens involved in decision-making and policy development. And citizens want to be involved in this role as well. I'm going to tell you a story about Ireland and its experience with citizens' assemblies.
The level of inclusion and support to people to give their opinions and their values and to share that, and for it to be considered and not shot down, has been absolutely amazing.
The 100 people that you have in the room have to be representative of your society, all of it.
With the diversity, I've met so many people that I would never have come into my zone before, you know, unless it was in this environment, and it's really fantastic.
Everyone in our country can look into that room and say, I'm there, I'm representative there, that's me.
It's 100 real people, and I really do believe we've represented our country and our future generations really well.
We expose them to enough information and perspectives that they develop an expertise in the subject.
The information you've given me has changed how I see things and how I go about my day. So I'm really thankful for that.
And at the end of that process, then we ask them the question, what will we do about the issue of women's health? So the citizens recommended an abortion regime which was much more liberal than the government had expected. And they said, oh, let's see. So the citizens in the room, they voted 67 to 33 for this women's health regime.
I found that we were able to say things that perhaps civil servants couldn't say.
When the question was put to the people of Ireland in a referendum, the result was 66-34, which proves two things. One is that room was perfectly representative of the Irish people. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Irish people were much more advanced in their thinking on this particular subject than the politicians were.
So that just gives you a little bit of an intro into one example, but as you can see here on this graph, there's actually been hundreds of these kinds of citizens' assemblies that have taken place in countries across the world. And even in Ireland alone, over the past decade, they've treated about a dozen different kind of issues through citizens' assemblies. So the abortion referendum that was mentioned was one of the outcomes of one assembly, but they've had 3 other constitutional referendums off the back of citizens' assemblies that recommended change, all of them leading to change positively. Ireland's Climate Act was heavily shaped by the citizens' assembly that deliberated on it. They also had other assemblies on gender equality, biodiversity loss, devolution of power, drug policy reform. So just to give you a kind of wider sense of the diversity of the types of issues that have been tackled, and that's just in one country. So the OECD, this is my former colleagues that updated the database that I had kind of established when I was working there, now counts 733 examples of these kinds of citizens' assemblies that have taken place, that have all been commissioned by public authorities. So this doesn't count ones that have been done more bottom up by civil society. And so we have a really huge wealth of evidence on best practices, establishing international standards of good practice principles. We also created evaluation guidelines and looked at different ways in which deliberative democracy is being institutionalized to be more than one-off processes taking place. And at DemocracyNext, we transformed a lot of that information into a much more kind of accessible and interactive guide online that I can share some links for after, if that's of interest. interest. And so these citizens' assemblies, I've been in a wider way, I've started talking more about deliberative assemblies, because we're seeing that these approaches are also now being used by other kinds of institutions like museums and companies and universities and so on. So that's the more kind of umbrella term for assemblies that are bringing together deliberation and sortition practices. So let me just unpack these two key principles a little bit more. So sortition is really an ancient word that has existed for a long time, and I know it's maybe unfamiliar to some, but I'm trying to familiarize it in the same way that we all know what elections are. I want everyone to know what sortition is, and this becomes something that's more normal. So it really just refers to what is often this two-stage process for selecting the members of a citizens' assembly. And in practice, that means in the first instance, there's often a very large number of invitations that goes out completely at random to a population. So often that can mean somewhere between 10 to 30,000 invitations, often in the form of a letter that gets signed by, it could be the president or the minister, the prime minister, the mayor, someone with the authority to then be able to act on those recommendations. And the letter sets out what's the issue that's going to be addressed. How is this process going to work? It answers frequently asked questions to try and break down those barriers to saying yes in the first place. So it outlines that, yes, people will be paid, childcare will be provided, no, you don't need to wear a suit to participate, all the things that might make someone hesitate. And amongst everyone who says yes, there is still some small bias in terms of the demographics that are saying yes, but we also have a lot of evidence which shows that it also reaches a lot of people who are not the people usually participating. There's a lot of people who've never voted, who've never gone to a town hall meeting, who've never been part of a political party who say yes. So in that second stage, there's another lottery, and this time there's that process called stratification to ensure that that final group is broadly representative in terms of things like gender, age, geography, socioeconomic criteria. Of course, this is a political question to determine by which criteria do we want this group to be representative of our community. And sorry, maybe just to add one thing, that the benefits of sortition are that the group that comes together then is much more diverse than a typical parliament or a typical group of self-selected individuals. They also have a certain independence because of the fact that, they're not there to try and be re-elected or to get funds for their next campaign or to represent an interest group. They're really all there equally just as members of the shared community. And there's also a cognitive diversity amongst a group of people. And there's a lot of research which shows that actually more diverse groups of people tend to lead to better decisions than more homogeneous groups, including groups of experts who are more likely to just reinforce one another's views. So there's kind of numerous layers on which there are benefits to using sortition as a mechanism for bringing a group of people together. And then the second element of deliberation means having a structured process that creates enough time for people to really build trust with one another, to be with the complexity of the issues that they're deliberating on, and really to strengthen people's sense of agency to be able to have an influence on decisions affecting them. So what I have here is kind of an overall of a schema of, let's say a kind of 5-day deliberation that happens. And, typically before these assembly processes, there is wider community engagement. So this is where there is some combination often of that more participatory approach with the deliberative democracy of the citizens' assembly. So trying to get wider input from a community's experiences to be part of an evidence base for a smaller but more representative group of people to consider when they're deliberating on the issue. At the start of these assemblies, it's really crucial, actually, this initial stage of people feeling welcome, getting to know one another. There's some research in the field that shows that it's the technical word for it in academia, it's called group building, but it's really that process of people building some trust. And it's been found that this is the thing that's most important for people's ability to really grapple with complexity in a deliberation. So it's crucial. And then there's usually a process at the beginning that helps people identify their shared values in relation to the issue that they're going to be deliberating on. The longest portion of a deliberation is really about learning. So coming to grips with the different perspectives, hearing from experts, but also experts in a broad sense, stakeholders who are affected, civil society organizations. It could also include faith group leaders, philosophers, people with lived experience of an issue. So really being able to hear all of those different sides around who's been affected by this. Of course, it's not kind of black and white learning into deliberation, but deliberation entails weighing all of that evidence that you've just heard, but also really working towards shared recommendations. So as I said earlier, it's not just about aggregating the individual people's views, but about working to that point around which, you know, often in these assemblies, you need around a 75 to 80% threshold of agreement for it to become a recommendation of the group. So there's really a lot of hard work being done to try and find that threshold where, you know, you're not ever going to have 100% of people who 100% agree with everything. You know, that's not possible, nor is it even maybe desirable, but you can get to that point where 80% of a group can say, okay, I can live with that. And maybe I don't fully agree, but I understand how we got to this decision together. So that's kind of where that transforms into the drafting of some concrete recommendations. There's often some form of voting procedure to determine that threshold of agreement and the delivery of those recommendations back to the public authority that initiated this process. And so we see that amongst these over 700 examples, cities are leading the way. Most of the examples have taken place at that city level. At the same time, that makes a lot of sense. We have a lot more cities in the world than countries. So I also don't want to suggest that this is not something that could or should be done at the national level as well, because we have a lot of really good examples. And there's been some interesting ones happening at a more international level in the EU, some EU level ones where there's been deliberations happening with people from 27 different countries and 24 languages. So we've been testing some new ground in the past few years as well. The types of problems that these citizens' assemblies have been well suited to address tend to be kind of values-based dilemmas, but you know, most issues have a values base underneath them. So I think sometimes we kind of divide things up as being about values or about technical questions, and of course there's usually a very technical component, but a lot of quite technical issues have a deeper layer underneath them about what kind of society do we want to be living in together. Usually the assemblies are tackling issues that are complex and require trade-offs and are about longer term questions as well. So you don't often find, actually it's not a very good practice to have a binary framed question. Even the abortion assembly in Ireland that was referenced earlier, it wasn't a yes or no question. It was really about, should we change the constitution on this issue? And if so, how should the legislation change? So it was actually a very nuanced conversation with a nuanced set of propositions that enable people to go into that gray zone of this complicated issue. We've seen that there have been really a super wide variety of policy issues that have been tackled by assemblies, and that most of them have tackled in some way some form of planning related issue. So you know, this corresponds to many of them being at the city level as well. So issues to do with environment or climate, strategic planning, urban planning, infrastructure. Again, these are the sorts of precisely very complex, often longer term in nature kind of issues that have been a bit thorny and sometimes are more difficult for politicians to be able to take action on without a process that enables some greater legitimacy to do something. So it's also why at DemocracyNext, we've been really working on cities in particular as one of our core areas. And last year we convened this international task force on democratizing city planning. We brought together a group of 15 experts from different countries, and this was a mix of urbanists, designers, architects, governance experts, developers and investors, so different parts of an ecosystem. And we worked virtually, and we also came together, this was in The Hague last year, to come up with what ended up being 6 proposals for democratizing city planning. And we learned from the different examples of the people in this group. So one of those examples is from Johan Gulster, who's kind of in the middle of this photo, the very tall Danish guy there. So he was involved in a project in Denmark, which was called the Citizens Assembly for the island of Lynetteholm. And so where the context for this was that there was a majority in the Danish parliament and the city council of Copenhagen that decided to build an artificial island in Copenhagen Harbor. So this is a really huge, massive, like 100-year, multi-billion euro project. But the debate around this island was, perhaps unsurprisingly in some ways, polarized and also filled with different dilemmas. Both the project, but also the process for the decision-making around it were heavily criticized by the public. So the city council ended up convening the Citizens Assembly framed around this question of how can Lynetteholm become a neighborhood that supports sustainable development for people, nature, and the environment in the capital region in the future. So to be able to address this, they brought together 66 residents that were selected by sortition. They deliberated over the course of 12 days, spread out over 10 months. And they ended up coming up with 11 recommendations that were really concrete. So those recommendations had sort of sub-recommendations within them as well, all of which they found 78 to 100% consensus on, and there was just one kind of minority opinion that ended up also being included in the report as well. And they presented this to Copenhagen's Lord Mayor in September 2023, and this is now in that process of kind of being reviewed fully by the city council before the assembly will be reconvened to hear back what is going to happen with their recommendations. And so in the paper around 6 ways to democratize city planning, we drew inspiration from this and other examples to think about what could be different kinds of assemblies that can take place at a city level to help address and involve people in a more meaningful way in an ongoing basis in planning decisions. So there can be ad hoc assemblies like the one that we just heard about on Lynetteholm if there's a really major, big, huge infrastructure issue or another issue that comes up that requires an ad hoc assembly. Otherwise, some cities we see have established citywide assemblies that are kind of permanent and ongoing, and every year there's a new group of people that are selected to be part of them. There's also community assemblies which exist at that slightly lower level of government at the neighborhood scale, which again, it's about thinking what is the relationship between all these different kinds of assemblies that are taking place. And we also thought about the relationships with the public authority, the city councils, the civil society organizations and developers, as well as those wider participatory strategies that I mentioned. So I just want to convey that none of this kind of sits in isolation and it's like, oh, citizens' assemblies are a magic bullet. It's for us, it's kind of thinking about how does this connect and what's the relationship in this wider ecosystem of institutions. And so these ideas are all detailed in a paper that I can also share with you. And so the work that we're doing at DemocracyNext is about these 3 I's of infrastructure, institutions, and innovations to try and push these ideas forward. So by infrastructure, we mean building the field. So we're not a practitioner organization that kind of goes and delivers assemblies for people. We really want more people in more places to know how to design and implement deliberative assemblies. So that's why we created our Assembling and Assembly Guide, and we are in the development of an online learning program that we're in the context of actually exploring different partnerships for. So maybe that's also a conversation to pick up on with folks here. When it comes to institutions, this is that thinking about how do we scale systemic change? So the work that we do is to try and ensure that there's that sustainable structural change. So we're interested in more than just one-off initiatives. How can we work to actually have a commitment towards ongoing assemblies that develop, a legal basis and have real power? Because at the end of the day, we want to be working to build new institutions. This is not just kind of another tool in the toolbox, but when you envision something as an institution, then you can also envision shifting real power to it as well. So some of the examples of what I mean by that include, this is a picture from Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking region of Belgium. They're the first place in the world to establish a legal basis for a permanent ongoing citizens' assembly. This was back in 2019, so I was involved as part of a small group of experts that kind of designed this process. And it's a community of about 80,000 people, so a really great place to be experimenting. And the powers that they have are, this being including Belgium, are actually quite significant at the parliament level there. And now they've had 6 different cycles of new groups of people that have been randomly selected and have addressed all sorts of different issues, which have ranged from how do we improve the working conditions of healthcare workers, which was something that they wanted to address actually before COVID happened. How do we better integrate people from an immigration background into our community? How do we solve the affordable housing crisis? So this system here in particular is that there's actually a council that has an agenda setting power, and they're the ones who determine the issue for that one-off assembly that happens every year. So as Belgium is small, but it's inspired the city of Paris to establish the permanent Paris Citizens Assembly, this is a photo from the first iteration. So this was in 2021 that they established this, and now the second group just finished their work. And it's pretty amazing because they worked towards actually drafting directly what ended up being called a citizen bill that went directly to a debate and a vote by the Paris City Council and was adopted just last week. So it's also been incredible to see the kind of maybe push one step further in terms of what are people working on. And they had worked from September of last year until April of this year on the issue of homelessness in the city. So they met for I think 5 learning sessions, 11 workshops where they went into the deliberation and drafting recommendations phase. They also had 3 field visits, and then they worked on those recommendations that were 20 recommendations in the bill that just got voted. And then one of the other projects that I was involved in a couple of years ago, also inspired by those 2 other projects, this is more pictures from the development of the design of the assemblies phase. This is David van Reybrouck, who's a quite well-known Belgian public intellectual working on these issues, where we designed a permanent climate assembly for the region of Brussels that has now also had a few iterations. So just to give you a few examples, there's more that have existed now, but there's more and more shift of this thinking about permanence. And the work that we're doing at DemocracyNext kind of takes these ideas in our different programs of work. So one of the projects that we did recently last year was working with the Bundeskunsthalle, which is Germany's national art museum, as well as the SKD, which is a design museum in Dresden, in another part of Germany, and both of them ran citizens' assemblies on democratizing the museum. So they had convened 36 people selected by sortition that met for 4 days, and they came up with a whole variety of recommendations to do with how do you make this actually a genuinely public and democratic space, because these are institutions that are funded, at least in most of Europe, publicly from the Ministry of Culture, but the people who are coming to the museums are not at all reflective of the wider population. And we have a lot of evidence which shows that actually people who are more engaged in culture are also more engaged in democracy. So because of sortition, most people had never been to a museum before who were part of this assembly process. And they came up with a whole bunch of different recommendations from related to the programming, to the public space, to the ways in which the language was used to describe things and so on. So and the Bundeskunsthalle has actually made this a permanent citizens assembly as well, that every year there's going to be a new group of people selected by sortition to work with them. And for us, this was also connected to 2 exhibitions that will open in both of the museums. So the first one just opened at the end of May at the Bundeskunsthalle around redesigning democracy, and the Assembly's work was featured as one part of the content in the exhibition. They didn't make the exhibition content, that was done by curators, but this is a photo from the opening night where most of those Assembly members are there with their families. So it's also kind of cool to see that people who've never been to a museum before are also now coming to the opening night, being thanked, each and every one of them by name by the director of the museum as well. So for me, it's interesting to see what are going to be the ripple effects of such a participation in society as well. We're also involved in a project that's happening right now in the US. So in Deschutes County in Oregon, we've been working with this really large group of organizations around a civic assembly on youth homelessness. And again, this is going to be the first of many assemblies because they're also working to institutionalize this. We're also kicking off, actually, I just had a first official meeting around this yesterday, a new project in collaboration with Mondragon and Aranzazu Lab, which is a democratic innovation lab in the Basque Country, and the MIT Center for Constructive Communication around democratizing economic institutions. So we're going to be doing some experiments in Mondragon, which is one of the world's biggest and oldest cooperatives. It's a federation of 81 cooperatives with about 70,000 worker owners who are there. So not an insignificant population actually who are there. So we're going to be identifying a few different pilots of things to do in a few of the co-ops that could then be scaled across all of Mondragon as well. And then finally, the third kind of eye that we work on is around innovation. So how can we still enable experimentation? Even though we have a lot of evidence about what works, I still think we need to be pushing the field forward. And for us, that is really about two main things. So we're working with the MIT Center for Constructive Communication in a collaboration around tech-enhanced deliberative assembly. So if I go back to that kind of schema of the assembly process, highlighted here in green are kind of the elements in which we're kind of experimenting with specific things. So because of time, I'm not going to go into any detail about those. I'm happy to elaborate in questions if people are interested, but just to say we're really thinking about technology in a way where we wanted to enhance the quality and the legitimacy and transparency and trustworthiness and inclusiveness of this process. So we're not trying to replace facilitators with AI or try and make the process shorter. We're really thinking about actually how could we use technology to help with some of the challenges in assemblies? How could it be used, for example, to help with this dynamic of people are often going from small groups to large groups to small groups to large groups? Could having recordings of those conversations and an ability to share highlights back and forth enable people to have a richer sense of what happened in the whole assembly process, as one example of the sorts of things that we're thinking about when we're considering how do we bring technology to enhance the deliberation. And then finally, the kind of last area of work that we're working on is around governing with the more than human world. So, maybe you're thinking, what do you mean by that? So we're really, this is more exploratory in nature, but I think especially when we're relating to issues like in cities and around climate change, but not only, there is this question of how do we think about the relationship that we have with the living world and how do we thoughtfully actually bring this into our decision-making processes. So we convened very recently a group of 15 practitioners across Europe who have been doing various experiments of things like interspecies councils, where people are kind of assigned to role play, you maybe you're the soil or you're the river or you're the tree, and if you bring that perspective into a deliberation, I'm a little skeptical about that on its own being the basis of decision-making directly, but I see a huge amount of value about bringing in those kinds of practices into a wider deliberation processes and getting people to really think kind of beyond the human actually as well, and that in that more relational way. So this is a little bit to be continued, but also a big area of interest. And we're trying to see how do we weave in some of these ideas into the wider work that we're doing around assemblies and around building new institutions. So, overall, the kind of vision of Democracy Next is that we believe in a more just, joyful, and collaborative future where everyone has meaningful power to be shaping their societies. So I hope that this presentation gave you a little bit of an insight of the kind of work and how citizens' assemblies could really be a central pillar for another kind of democratic future. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that breathtaking sweep of all these interesting things. And I was so curious that there were larger assemblies, but also really nice small ones, especially at the museums. And I'm particularly taken by the one on Mondragon because I'm a fan of worker-owned co-ops. And I remember Trevor Schultz, and he had a residency at Mondragon, and he basically invented the term platform cooperatives. And he said this, which I remembered, was that we make a big deal about political democracy, but that's one vote in 4 years. Workplace or economic democracy, that's 80% of your time. So that's way more meaningful as a sphere of democratization. And so that was interesting. But I'm sure there are a lot of questions for you later, but I would like to move on to Swarna now to take us through the Children's Parliament in India. Over to you, Swarna.
Thank you very much, Justin. So once again, good evening, and thank you very much, Claudia, for such a lovely and wonderful presentation. I feel that I learned a lot. My presentation is about my journey from Children's Parliament to global arenas. And I will be sharing my personal journey and experiences, which have taken me from participating in children's parliaments to advising about governance at the global. And I hope that my stories and insights that I share will inspire you to see the potential of children in leadership roles and the importance of bottom-up governance. Next slide, please. Our societies need bottom-up governance. This approach emphasizes the importance of emphasizing involving all members of society, including children in the decision-making process. Just as adults might find new technologies like mobile phones complex, by children find it quite easy to navigate them. Similarly, the same could be said for the bottom-up governance. Children often grasp the concept more naturally than adults. And Singapore, I think, has a unique opportunity to lead the way in mutual leadership between adults and children, showing the world how this partnership can work step by step. Next slide, please. I am dividing my presentation into 4 parts. First, I'll be talking about my personal experience. Second, I will talk about the structure of the adult and children's parliaments and the sociocratic governance method. Third, I will talk about some research that indicate the structure is effective. And finally, I'll conclude by sharing my vision for Singapore as a model nation that incorporates this innovative method of governance. In this vision, mutual leadership and neighborhood-based federated units connect grassroots communities to the national level, building a more inclusive and effective democracy. Next slide, please. Let me start with my personal experience. I began my journey in a secluded school for the blind. At the age of 10, I joined the Children's Parliament, which marked the beginning of my active involvement in governance. By the age of 13, I have been selected by the children to increasingly higher levels of office and had the honor of speaking at the United Nations and influencing Sustainable Development Goal 4, which focuses on quality education. My mother used to say something. As a leader, be the first to walk the path you want others to follow. And therefore, as I advocated in the United Nations about inclusive education, I started realizing, well, I have got this opportunity of being included through Children's Parliament. I got this opportunity of addressing for inclusive education at the United Nations. Now I have addressed this. Now I want everybody else who are pursuing their education in a secluded school like me to gain the same amount of opportunity that I gained. So if I want them to gain, then I should first take the path of pursuing my education inclusively in a mainstream environment. And therefore, at the age of 14, I transitioned to a regular school. It was not that easy, of course. Many of the schools denied admission in my own region just because of the fact that I have a disability. And I had to transition, I had to move to a nearby state to find out my education. And because of the experience I gained through Children's Parliament and because of the skill of advocacy that Children's Parliament gave me as a gift, I could advocate to the right person for my inclusive education and made them understand. And I finally got admitted in a mainstream school. Although the teachers were initially unwelcoming, they were receptive later. And of course, by pursuing my education in a regular school, it broadened my horizons. I have countless stories of children influencing. I have countless stories of children influencing various levels of, excuse me. I have countless stories of children influencing various levels of government, proving age is no barrier to leadership. These stories include my personal involvement in resolving stagnant water issues, saving electricity by reducing street light burning hours, initiating 1 rupee campaigns, etc. Additionally, we have provided relief measures for tsunami victims and supported indigenous communities, helping them obtain a crucial document in 1 year that they struggled to get for a decade. Our advocacy efforts also reached the chairperson of the upper house of the Indian Parliament, where we successfully campaigned for allocating 9% from the country's GDP to children's welfare. On the global stage, we've advocated for inclusion at the United Nations and contributed to the drafting of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, before their release. A significant highlight was the documentary Power to the Children, which captures some of these inspiring stories. Watching the trailer of this film can provide you a glimpse of what impact the children can make when they're given a platform like Children's Parliament that follows the sociocratic governance method. I request Rachel to play the trailer.
Can't hear the audio, Rachel.
And for whatever concerns at the respective territorial levels.
என்னடா நீ ஆமா நீனு ஸ்கூல் பக்கம் போன கைகள் ஏய் என்னங்க டெய்லி குடிச்சிட்டே வரீங்க இப்படி குடிச்சிட்டு வந்தாலும் என்னங்க பண்றது பிள்ளைங்க படிப்பெல்லாம் கிளாஸ்னா ஃபியூச்சரோட ஏன் டாபிக் பேசலாம் இன்க்ளூஷன்
His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, United Nations Headquarters, New York, USA. May we request you to help organize a World Parliament of Children?
If we as children can listen to each other and speak in one voice, if as children we know what teamwork means, if we can share and care beyond differences, then so can the rest of the world.
Thank you. I hope you all would have watched the trailer. And now I'm moving on to the second part of my presentation, which is about the structure of the children and as well as the adults' neighborhood structures and parliaments. So both adult as well as children's parliaments operate on 5 key principles. First is numerical uniformity, ensuring each parliament is of the size proportionate to their geographical location to provide equity and fair representation. For example, if one neighborhood has 10 families, if another has 100 families, having a representative from each does not provide a fair representation, right? So the solution is to break down the 100 family neighborhoods into smaller neighborhoods. And the second principle is small in size. Smaller groups are more manageable and effective. Therefore, keeping the group small in size with a limitation of 25 to 30 families in a circle so that the groups are large enough to be self-sufficing and small enough to be well-governed. I've just taken the quote of Aristotle because in circles, we wanted to keep it both small and as well as large so that we will be able to communicate without microphones and by having a bond together, communicating with each other face to face. And the third principle is recall scope. Representatives can be recalled quickly if they are not served the group effectively. And the fourth principle is subsidiarity, which is decisions should be made at the most local level possible, depending on the issue. And fifth principle is convergence, integrating several similar systems together to avoid needless conflicts and duplicacy. These parliaments work based on federations. Children from 30 families, they come together. It could be children or adults, anybody, but they come together from 30 families on a common platform and they discuss issues that they see around them. I mean, when I was a child, I've been doing the same thing too. And 30 of such neighborhoods would elect a representative to a village level. And similarly, it gets federated at various levels, like that of village, sub-district, district, city, state, nation, and even at the global level. In the picture, you can see how the federation works. So the core of the picture shows you the world level. And for more detailed insights about the application of these principles, I recommend the book Hello Neighborocracy to you. And the link is just in the slides that you can see. Moving on to the next slide, how do we incorporate sociocracy into the children's parliament structure? So before going into that, let me first talk about what are the key principles of sociocracy. First, sociocracy is a governance system that emphasizes equality and inclusiveness. So there are 4 key principles of sociocracy. The first one is consent decision making. Consent means acceptance rather than agreement. I was just listening to Claudia, and then I heard Claudia saying that we would, when we make decisions, we would think whether we are able to live with it. I really captured that word. That word really attracted me. Thank you for using it. And you were also mentioning, Claudia, that people may not always agree, which is very right. Yes, people may not always agree. And as you rightly said, they can understand if, where this decision comes from. So I really, really enjoyed that bit. And that's exactly what consent is. So decisions are made when no one has a paramount objection. So in other words, when we think about making decisions, we think about whether things are good enough for now and safe enough to try. And the second principle is circles, small groups that have similar aim or activity, and they together make policy decisions. For example, about how things are done. The children in the picture are meeting at school in circles organized by neighborhood and not by their grades. So they're making policy decisions concerning their neighborhoods. And the third principle is double linking. Representatives ensure communication and alignment between circles by linking them together. Representatives enable the system to federate higher and higher levels. And the fourth principle is election by consent. Leaders are chosen based on consent and not by majority vote and not by consensus. You may ask that, well, you've already shared about consent. Why you're talking about election based on consent? So basically, election based on consent is just a sub-principle of the principle 1. And we are separating it because election, we are used to having elections based on majority voting. And so we thought we will name it. I just remember an example that how we sort of used consent when I was a child electing a finance minister for our state. When we were all together sitting in a circle electing our finance minister, we were discussing the quality roles and expectations, and that we were thinking that, well, mathematics and accounts seems to be, those seem to be really important for somebody to become a finance minister. And when somebody wanted to propose themselves as a finance minister, they did that. And we all were also wanting them to become a finance minister, but there was a small objection because that person doesn't know mathematics. Even that person herself had an objection in her becoming as a finance minister, just because of the reason that they may not know mathematics and accountancy. And it's a valid objection. So we were thinking together, what do we do to resolve this? And then finally, an idea stuck. So together in the circle, we decided that let that person become a finance minister, but we'll try with them for 2 months. And just to supplement them, just to support them with accounts and mathematics, why don't we have a deputy finance minister? So when that idea originated, we were really happy. So we were trying to shrink down the decision as much as possible. And then we were also trying to implement it to see if this works or not for a short period of time, along with the deputy finance minister. So that's kind of consent. So when you have consent, then consent decision making would provide all sorts of creative means and ways to think about something. For more information about sociocracy and its principles, I recommend you all the book, We the People Consenting to a Deeper Democracy, authored by Mr. John A. Buck. Next slide, please. So apart from children's neighborhood structures, there are some successful neighborhood structures similarly organized to that of children's neighborhood parliaments. So I'm sharing with you some successful examples of neighborhood structures around the world. You will have access to these slides, and each underlined is a link to further information about them. I'm going to talk about 6 of such examples. The first one is neighborhood parliaments in India. These local governance bodies empower communities by providing them with a platform to make decisions collectively. Each neighborhood parliament consists of representatives who are chosen by the community, ensuring that the voices of residents are heard and respected. This model has proven effective in addressing local issues, enhancing community participation, and building a sense of ownership among residents. The second model is Kudumbashree model in Kerala, a state in India. Kudumbashree is primarily a women's collective and has revolutionized local governance and economic development in Kerala. It consists of neighborhood groups who come together to address social and economic issues. This initiative has empowered women by providing them with the tools and resources to start small businesses and participate in local governance and contribute to community development. Kudumbashree's success lies in its ability to mobilize women at the grassroots level and create sustainable livelihoods. The number of women in the Kerala political system has grown dramatically. The third one is PRATYek's work. And in this initiative, PRATYek works both top-down and as well as bottom-up. PRATYek works on every right for every child. It is a non-governmental organization that organized this campaign called NINEISMINE that recommends that 9% from the country's GDP needs to be allocated for children's education and health. And this NINEISMINE campaign supports children's parliaments, and the children's parliaments are at the local, regional, national, and international level for PRATYeK. In terms of bottom-up model, PRATYeK even helps children to engage at the process, in the process that I mentioned previously called Universal Periodic Review, which is one of the UN mechanisms. They collect inputs from the grassroots children and try to take them to the global level. And from the global to local, for these mechanisms, UN mechanisms, you really need some training. Let it be on these UN mechanisms, or engaging in children's parliament activities, or engaging in the advocacy. Children need some training. So these trainings are provided from global to local. For example, globally, children are they get trained, and at the regional level and the national level, the children are also invited for training. I mean, child representatives at the local parliaments are invited for training, and these child representatives go to their local area and teach their peers and train their peers on these mechanisms, on effectively engaging into UN mechanisms, effectively engaging in children's parliament, or on anything. The fourth one is Rojava, North and East Syria. Rojava is an autonomous region of about 5 million people practicing direct bottom-up democracy. The governance model in Rojava is based on principles of decentralization, gender equality, and ecological sustainability. Local councils are established at the neighborhood level, where residents can directly participate in decision-making processes. This model has been successful in creating a more inclusive and participatory form of governance, despite the challenging political and security context in the region. The fifth one is sociocratic neighborhood circles in 6 European Union countries, funded by an Erasmus grant. This project explores the implementation of sociocratic principles at the neighborhood level by trying to replicate the experience in India. Sociocracy is a governance system that emphasizes equality, transparency, and collective decision-making. So in this project, neighborhood circles are formed where residents can discuss issues, make decisions, and implement solutions together. This approach aims to enhance social cohesion and empower communities by giving them a greater say in the local governance. Finally, the sixth model is Utrechtse Heuvelrug in the Netherlands. This municipality uses sociocratic methods to enhance local governance. In Utrechtse Heuvelrug, residents are involved by consent in city's policy decision-making processes. The city government and the citizens collaborate to make sure everyone's voice is heard and respected, leading to a more inclusive and effective governance. Next slide, please. I'm moving into the third part of my presentation, which is whether this really works. So of course, I'm sure you would all have that question in mind, and I'm going to share with you some literatures and researches that were done around them. I'm going to divide these researches into 3 parts. Researches done in terms of companies, how sociocracy, being a governance method, is working in companies, and then second one is how sociocracy is working effectively in terms of school context with the children, and then finally how sociocracy is effective in terms of governance. So these are the 3 things I'm going to explore in this slide. In Austria, research has shown a 38% increase in efficiency in companies that adopt these principles. Other studies highlight improved decision-making efficiency, increased employee engagement, better conflict resolution, transparency, and accountability. In the USA, children's scores on reflective judgment reached new heights in a school that uses sociocratic methods that involve the children. I'll linger on, for a moment on this example. A study by Lectica Testing Service found that students from a private school called Rainbow Community School scored significantly higher on reflective judgment than their peers in the best private and public schools. The Rainbow students, who were from a variety of economic background, helped run the school sociocratically. through mutual leadership with the teachers. So the bottom line in the chart shows the scores of students from mediocre schools. The two lines in the middle show the best previously recorded scores. One line shows the scores from the best private school and the other line from the best public school. The top line shows the scores of Rainbow Community School 4th graders and 8th graders. They are better than the best previous scores by an astounding statistical confidence of probability less than 0.01. The Rainbow students scored as well as best the 11th graders despite being in 8th grade, showing that they were 3 grades ahead. This data suggests a very strong benefit of children participating in meaningful parliaments using sociocracy methods. Of course, we do look forward for other such studies, but this strongly suggests that there is something really significant in children's parliaments. I'm now moving to governance. So in governance, let's see how sociocracy and what are the researches done to prove sociocracy had been effective. So Kerala, a state in India, received a UN award for handling COVID-19 better. So it received a UN award. And Tamil Nadu, another state in India, received a UN award in 2009 for its achievements. My own master's thesis explores the application of sociocracy in children's parliaments in global governance and policymaking. The World Children's Parliament is yet another example of children leading the way in governance. With regard to World Children's Parliament, we recently convened a side event at the United Nations, which seemed to be really difficult, and children found a way because when people said that it's not possible to convene a side event without the support of member states, the children themselves found a way that during the ECOSOC Youth Forum, there is a possibility to convene an online side event, and the children took efforts to implement it. And the highlight is that the World Children's Parliament is the only entity that had recommendations presented in the side event at the United Nations. And the experiences in Utrecht, Heuvelrug, Netherlands, and Rojava, as discussed previously, highlight the potential of these models in various cultural contexts. I just spoke about Rojava and Utrecht, Heuvelrug again because Utrecht, Heuvelrug is in the Netherlands, which is in Europe, and Rojava is in Syria, which is in the Middle East. Both have two different cultural contexts, but when both were able to implement sociocracy, it shows its effectiveness of being beyond cultures. Next slide, please. In conclusion, bottom-up governance incorporating principles of sociocracy and bottom-up governance and mutual leadership between adults and children has the potential to transform societies. This slide suggests that this potential for transformation is best pursued in many small steps analogous in agile process now used in software development. I don't have time now to discuss these typical agile steps, but I do encourage Singapore to explore the potential of neighborhood parliaments, including children's parliaments, to create a deeper form of democracy that values and leverages the contribution of all its citizens, regardless of age. Next slide, please. We are living in complex, troubled times. Around the world, we face numerous challenges that require innovative solutions and collective action. We need to act now to govern ourselves better. The traditional ways of governance and decision-making are not sufficient to address the evolving needs of our societies. It's crucial to establish new ways to make decisions that are more inclusive, transparent, and effective. We must adapt to the changing landscape by implementing governance models that reflect our current realities. One of the key aspects of this new approach is mutual leadership. This means building collaboration between children and adults working together as equal partners. By including the voices of all age groups, we can ensure a more holistic and representative decision-making process. Governance from below is starting to happen in different places around the world. Is Singapore willing to be a leader in exploring these new ways? Singapore has a potential to set an example for the world by pioneering innovative governance models that promote inclusivity and mutual leadership. By doing so, we can inspire other nations to follow suit and collectively work towards a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swarna. Let's see if I can convince my wife to have mutual leadership with the kids at home in a small way. But now we actually have, Swarna, you've invited a special guest to be in the audience. John Buck is with us, and I wondered if John wrote this book, We the People Consenting to a Deeper Democracy. I wondered if you wanted to share some reflections or comments at this point.
I think Swarnalakshmi was more articulate than I could be. I think the important point is that this is now a time to think originally about how we're governing. And democracy does not have to be the system of majority vote that's evolved to this point. It can keep evolving. And it seems like something that is more inclusive may have potential for helping us govern ourselves better and handle the complexities that we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Now, actually, I would like to invite some of our discussants if they are ready. Maybe we'll go with Xiaoling first. Xiaoling's from the Singapore Children's Society. And so that's a nice segue to talking about the Children's Parliament. Xiaoling, you want to introduce yourself and share some of your reflections?
Yep, sure, Justin. I can comment on both, right? I don't have to just limit myself to Swarna's presentation because I felt that both presentations link very nicely. And I must say a big thank you to Claudia and to Swarna for really taking the time and effort to, try to introduce us to a lot of, new processes and terms and concepts within such a short time. So thank you very much. And I really learned a lot. Okay, so maybe I could just start off with, one of the particular concept that I felt was very interesting for me, that I gleaned from Claudia's presentation is this idea of sortition. It's really my first time hearing about it. So yeah, great to hear about it and learn about it here. Because I think, I think as we try to encourage, children and youth participation, whether it's at the agency level or national level, it is very easy to run into a situation where you have the cream of the crop, just participating, the best students, the ones that teachers feel that, oh, I should nominate you because, you've always performed very well in class, or that, I know you're able to, regulate your emotions well and present your views well. So we run into that kind of situation, and I think it's pretty common, maybe not just in Singapore, but in other countries as well. So I think that idea of a sortition is interesting because it really tries to bring in a more diverse representation of voices. But I do have some question about it, which is, it sounds like it's a very big scale thing to carry out, because you were saying that the initial invite just goes into like tens of thousands, right? And then finally, you go through that two-step process to eventually almost reaching like a randomized control group, right? Like to derive at a small pool that is representative, and yet you are able to draw in people who may not voluntarily have put their own hands up, to nominate themselves. So I do wonder also whether sortition might also be possible to happen in a smaller scale. So maybe that's one of the questions for Claudia. And as I was listening also to Claudia and Swarna, I was also reminded of the Lundy's model of child participation, which essentially talks about, having the 4 quadrants of creating that space for children and youth to participate, getting their voices into the discussion of issues that concern them. But, in addition to that, we also need to let these voices and these inputs and views reach the audience, people who actually have the influence to make changes, policymakers, government, political holders. And then, of course, the last quadrant is having the influence to make change. So I think that maybe the space, voice, and audience is not too difficult to arrive at. But I find that influence, it's a big one, and it can be quite challenging. And if I were to maybe link it to Swarna's, presentation at this moment, is that in general, I think adults have the mindset that, children are not mature enough. What do they know, right? And how can I, really entrust them to make decisions on my behalf? And so that is really, I think, a perennial question of are adults ready to let go of that control? Are adults ready to trust that, sometimes children and youth might actually have, good solutions that we adults cannot come up with? Right. So just to quote a simple example, we are now talking about safety in the digital world. So a lot of policies and legislation are driven by what adults think would be good for the children, for the youth. But in our conversations with youth, asking them about their own experiences in the online world, I think that they are a very sensible group, because they recognize that the online world is not just about harms, right? And it's no use if parents just keep restricting and limiting our access to the internet, because we can find loopholes around it, and they're very good at doing that, much more better than us, right, in navigating the online world. So I think in that regard, we don't really understand firsthand the experiences of children and youth in particular issues, especially those that are far remote from what we had grown up with, right? So I think it is really, really necessary as we move into this, the future, as we discuss about issues like generative AI, for example, that we really, really need to include children and youth in this discussion, and in even, deciding actually what would be the best way forward, what policies would make sense, what legislation would make sense. So I think that's really critical, but yet at the same time, I feel like adults are not quite ready to let go of their control yet. So maybe my question to Swana would be that, what do you think adults, like educators, parents, even NGOs or the government, right, can do more of? And what can the children and the youth do? Or, how do we change this mindset to kind of get the adults ready and prepared to say that, hey, sometimes you could, maybe just loosen a little bit of the control, and you might just see wonderful innovations or ideas coming from the children and youth. Yeah, so thank you very much. That's my thoughts in a nutshell.
Thanks, Yao Ling. Maybe we'll have Shwarna respond to that question before we go to Carol. How do we get parents to trust their kids in the trust the process?
So what in our experience, what would happen is that usually children tend to, when they start doing things, parents would ask, well, what can children do? That's exactly the mindset. But when children start doing things, for example, you can actually, I would really recommend that you watch the film Power to the Children, where it's portrayed. So parents would think that, well, what are you going to do? But when they see children doing things, then they also start cooperating with us. Initially, let me share a little bit of my experience. When my parents were also like that. I am from strong cultural, strong South Indian background, where parents think that, well, you're a child, and as a child, you're supposed to obey me. So the obedience, the matter of obedience, is something that's of utmost importance in my family. But after joining Children's Parliament, when I started participating in decision making, I learned how to incorporate decision. So that's what sociocracy brings as a governance method. So when you're thinking something, when I'm thinking something, let's think of how do we incorporate together. Like if you're wanting to close the window, if I'm wanting to open the window, let's think about how do we open it as well as close the window. So that kind of incorporation, that we call it as both and thinking. So that kind of thinking really helped me to acquire that a strong support. And with that both and thinking, when I started participating in the decision making in my family, they initially felt like, well, my child is just unnecessarily intervening. But then they started thinking that, well, I think there is something that she says is really important. And that also made them see different frameworks, and they started respecting my decision. This is just at the home level. But in terms of Children's Parliament, when adults together formulate, like let me tell you an experience we had with the World Children's Parliament. With the World Children's Parliament, the adults, some of us, like I'm a youth advisor. So as youth and adults, we were able to see something that the children were not. And the children were able to see something that we could not. For example, with regard to the convening the side event, we thought that side event is not possible without the member states, but children saw that and we appreciated it. So that when they see, then sociocracy gives an opportunity to hear everybody's voice equally and to kind of like set up ground rules and, you know, to set up facilitation structure. And that structure really helps us, you know, gain that, to break that power imbalance to an extent. I've also mentioned a few examples in my master's thesis as well. And if you're interested, I'm happy to share that with you too, through Justin and team.
Thank you. Thank you, Swarna. Now let's have Carol. Carol's done quite a bit of designing and scoping of various citizens panels in Singapore, and I wonder if you could share a reflection on whether some of the features that Claudia has specifically mentioned, like something like sortition, would work, because we don't do that, or we haven't done it, and maybe just to hear your thoughts on, well, just any general reflections in and what you think the future of citizen participation in Singapore could look like. Carol?
Thanks, Justin. Thank you, Claudia and Swarna, for your presentations. Learned heaps, especially on some of the principles that you identified are core to the processes that both of you have done so much work in. So sortition, yes, it's a term that I've just come across, but in reality, I think in some ways we are doing that. So since 2017, I've had the opportunity to work with various government agencies to develop and to convene citizens panels, slightly different name, but very close to some of the principles that Claudia has described for Citizens Assembly, essentially, where people from different backgrounds are brought together to discuss in great depth and, using information that are shared with them, whether it's in a form of data or in a form of resource person. And they actually go through a relatively long, protracted process of discussing with one another, thinking about the trade-offs. And at the end of the process, they arrive at a consensus of what are the proposals they want us, a collective, to pitch to the policy sponsors, right? So in recruiting the people for each of those citizens panels that I have had the chance to work on, we did in a way go through a similar two-step process as well. So for example, the first step really was to try to reach as many people as possible through different ways, so that hopefully people who we want at the table would have a chance to come to the table, right? So we're talking about doing recruitment online, but bearing in mind that not everybody is online. We also do recruitment offline. So with a particular agency, we even experimented with mailers that were sent to mailboxes. But we learned that, well, snail mail is dying. So the response rate from those mailers was actually very low. So we do that. That's the first stage. And clearly from the first stage, we will attract a large number of response. More people would indicate their interest, many more than we had planned to take on for each process, right? Because for each citizens panel, the group is kept at a relatively manageable size. Based on those I worked on, they range from about 50 to close to 80. So at the second stage, we then go through the details, the data that they submitted to us, and that's where we do the stratification that Claudia mentioned, right? To ensure that we have diversity and that people from different demographic groups, but also different profiles that are key to the policy problem at hand are represented. So let me give a concrete example of that. So Yiling is in the room. She's from the Ministry of Manpower. We recently collaborated last year on a citizens panel on employment resilience. So for that, we developed a sampling frame where we wanted to where we identified few key groups of stakeholders, right? So one would clearly be, if we're talking about employment resilience, like clearly one of the key sector would be employees. But even within employees, we sub-segmented into employees who are working full-time, employees who are doing work part-time, employees who are employed in part-time or gig work, given the prevalence of gig work, as well as those who are maybe out of a job and are looking for employment. So this sampling frame and the deliberate sub-segmenting is critical so that we make sure that we don't miss out on the people we need to hear from in this process. Then besides employees, we have employers, and then we also further sub-segmented employers into those who work in MNCs, those who work in sole proprietors, and those who work in small, medium-sized enterprises. So I would say, in the work that we have done here, I think these two-step process is also in place. But now I've got a neater word to use, a sortition, right? Maybe in my reflection to both Claudia's and Swarna's presentations, I think what really stood out to me is the concept of trust, which I think is really important. And I look at trust in three ways, right? One is people's trust in the process, which I think is really important to get them to be part of the process, to get them to really step up and step forward to join the Citizens Assembly or the Citizens Panel. And in order to, I think, have or gain and build that trust, I think it's very fundamental for the conveners of the process to really understand what is the intent and objective of us doing something like that, because there is no golden methodology or golden tool to do citizen engagement. Citizens assemblies and citizens panels need not be the one way to do it. It really does depend on the purpose and the desired outcomes. And I would say citizens panel would be good, to tackle relatively complex issues where we expect to hear a wide range of views, and sometimes the views might be conflicting. Citizens panel might also be a good process for policy issues where maybe policymakers currently have no answers for. And number three, and this is where I thought the point that Claudia made was interesting, right? Where she started her discussion, her presentation, when she said that Citizens Assembly has the ability to help shift the power of decision making. But I think when designed in a certain way to answer very specific outcomes, Citizens Assemblies or even citizens panels can actually help shift the power of action from policymakers to citizens. So, for example, the couple that I have managed to work on, the problem statement is framed in a very deliberate way where the participants are expected to come up with solutions that not just policymakers are responsible for, but also different stakeholders like communities in the society and NGOs, social service agencies, and even private companies. So I would say that's one thing to be very clear about the process. The other thing is what Claudia also mentioned about group building, right? Which you said is important. Is to build trust among people, between people in the process. And I completely agree, right? I think for the process to work, to be meaningful, and to have long-term effects in getting people interested and staying committed to engagement and participatory democracy, is for them to have trust in one another. So one important thing I've learned from some of the work that we have done is to be very transparent about who's in the process and who's not in the process. So for example, in a citizens work group that I worked on, where we got the people to think about recycling, I had some participants who came up to me and asked, oh, my friend or people from this particular NGO actually applied and indicated that they want to be part of the process and they weren't selected, and we are wondering why. So we felt and we realized that it's very important for us to clarify and explain to participants the recruitment process and even the selection process, right? So, and the other thing is building trust among people. I think the acknowledgement has to be articulated that they are all different, but everyone is working towards a common goal. And this is not just a motherhood statement, but I think a realization that can come to bear through the process of deliberation, where they hear from people who are very different from them. So then therein lies the importance of designing a process in a way that really surfaces different aspirations, different values, so that people acknowledge and they see that the others at this table or in the room are different from them, but they're all working towards a common purpose. And finally, my comment is pertaining to one of the two things that Claudia mentioned in moving forward, the use of technology to improve the process. I think technology has a huge potential in reducing the parity in participation, because in a lot of these in-person face-to-face citizens panels, we still see a slight underrepresentation of certain segments in the society. And oftentimes these are people who might be structurally inhibited to participate. So hopefully technology with its ubiquity, can help close some of these gaps. But maybe then this could be something, that Claudia could comment on when thinking about the use of platform, besides some of the ways that you've highlighted in your presentation. I'm thinking about the tension between anonymity and identity, right? We know the benefits of anonymity. It does have some benefits, but also it has unforeseen negative consequences like bullying, sexual harassment, as observed in some participatory online environments that use augmented reality. So that's one, right? How do we balance anonymity and also the use of identity for that sense of security? Number two is moderation, right? In the online context, moderation can be done in so many ways. It can be automated, etc. But then, how much moderation is enough and how much moderation is excessive, right? Because one negative consequences of moderation could be the people having the perception that there's censorship, or they're not allowed to contribute, or only certain types of contributions are allowed and favored over others. So these are my comments. But maybe Swarna, thank you so much for sharing Children's Parliament. It reminded me of a citizens panel that I did with young people, youth. And here we're talking about those aged 17 and 19, much older than the ones that you mentioned. But likewise, when they engage in the process and they speak with resource persons, some of the people who were in the room, particularly their teachers, right, were surprised. They came up to me after the session and said, wow, the students asked really good questions. I'm so surprised by the quality of their questions. And I'm thinking, why should we be surprised by the quality of the young people's questions? Is it because we assume, that they are not capable of, asking certain types of questions or questions that are of certain standards? So I'm just curious, from your point of view, in your observations of the different types of sociocracies, do you feel that there are specific types of tools or mechanisms that can be put in place to help build children's competencies when they participate in children's parliaments? Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Before we get to those questions, I'd actually like to, so Carol asked about anonymity and identity, really at the frontiers of citizen participation, and but I think it's before jumping to the frontier, I was hoping that Claudia could respond to maybe what the political office holders or civil servants might be thinking about. Because to do citizens' assemblies, it's a headache, it's expensive, it's time consuming. There are certainly benefits, but I would like to appreciate the operating circumstances and considerations that they might have. it might also be a little bit scary to share power. What if decisions go a way that we don't agree with? So maybe you could speak to that, and then I'll invite some of the civil servants in the room if they could respond to your response to see whether it convinces them one way or the other. That'd be interesting. So I'm coming to ITK. I can see URA in the room. I can see MOM, MCCY, MDDI, and MUIS. The arrow might be coming to you, but you're free to reject that if you want. But over to you, Claudia.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, and thanks very much, Xiaoling and Carol, for those really thoughtful comments and replies. I mean, I'll jump to your question, Justin, and then if I can, maybe add just one or two things in response to what was said by both of them too. So you know, you were asking to do citizens' assemblies. It can be, you know, kind of a headache or expensive or complicated, and then there's also a question of sharing power, and you know, why would you do this in some ways? And so I think the main motivations that I've come across which tend to vary a little bit if you're on the political side or on the civil service, public administration side about why would you want to do this. But, you know, they typically fall in two categories. One is that, you know, often the starting point is not necessarily, you know, we want to innovate democracy, we want to innovate citizen participation, but it's like, we have this really hard problem and we're a bit stuck and we've tried various things and we clearly don't have the solution, or maybe politically we're stuck because for whatever reason, you know, there's a lack of desire to take a decision on this now. And so this might be a process that can help us get to some new ideas, things we haven't tried yet, and also to have that legitimacy to be able to take action on something. So that tends to be, I would say, the predominant and most common kind of perspective of like, why do we want to do this? I would say, though, that in there's another kind of set of reasonings, which is related to kind of taking a step back into looking at the bigger picture of what's going on with politics and democracy in many countries around the world today, and seeing a rise in autocratic and authoritarian tendencies and people questioning the value of democracy and people turning to extremes in all sorts of ways. And I think a recognition, at least among some, this tends to be a bit more on the political side, I would say, but among some politicians who really see that actually, you know, there are some deeper roots and reasons for people's lack of voice and agency in being able to shape decisions that are affecting their lives that are at the heart of some of these trends that we see. You know, why did phrases like take back control and so on really resonate with so many people? I'm referring to contexts I'm more familiar with here in Europe, but I think that these are wider international trends, and at least from some of the conversations I've had with elected officials in different countries, for them, there's a recognition that, you know, along the lines of what I think it was John who said earlier, you know, democracy needs to continue evolving as well. And, you know, they don't have all the answers to everything either. And there needs to be some kind of move towards innovating the systems and the processes that we have that, you know, I think we see have a limit in the context of the complexity of a lot of the issues that we face today. So I think that those are kind of the main reasons. And, you know, I do recognize that there is a certain level of complexity and expense to a citizens' assembly versus maybe other participatory processes as well. And that's where, in my mind, I have a different lens on this. I don't see it as just another tool in a toolbox. I really see it as like, this is an investment in building the foundations of new democratic institutions. You know, when we think about elections, all the democratic infrastructure that sits around them, we kind of take it for granted and we don't think about the cost and the expense. And actually running an election is pretty complicated, but we've gotten used to the basic principle behind it, which is simple. And I think it's the same thing here. There's a basic principle behind all this, which is simple, and it feels really complicated because it's also new and less familiar, and it's often more work because we're lacking that wider democratic infrastructure to support it. And that's where we've seen a change in the places that have been institutionalizing, and there's now a permanent general secretariat that sits in the public administration that does the sortition, that, you know, is independent from any policy domain and is not pushing a certain policy agenda, but that has that infrastructure there. So to me, that's the kind of future that I kind of want us to see, and the way to talk about it. It's why I talk about people who are in these assemblies as members of them, the way we would talk about members of parliament. We don't talk about a city council or a parliament as a tool. You know, I think to me, that's where kind of the mindset shift, at least the way that I see this work, kind of comes into it. And maybe just very, very briefly, because I'm mindful of time and we want some questions, but I really, your questions, Xiaoling, were really great, and it makes me want to include some new slides for future presentations about the great children's assemblies that we've seen taking place, because there were children's assemblies that worked alongside the kind of, I guess, adult assemblies that took place on climate change in Scotland, on biodiversity loss in Ireland, at a local level in the Basque Country, in a project I was involved in the city of Tolosa, around mental health and well-being in the city. They also did a children's assembly. And again, it kind of speaks to this principle that you alluded to, that actually there's an issue when you do have children's initiatives and so on. It's usually a certain, the best in class and those who are most confident already and so on, who end up volunteering or doing things or being nominated to do stuff. And with Sortition, actually, you bring in such a wider diversity of people. And I think what was amazing was not only that they came up with brilliant ideas that were incorporated with the main assembly's recommendations together, and the children also met with the ministers and so on, but what it activated in those children and their sense of agency. So like in Scotland, it was really interesting to hear the stories of the children that, after they were in this climate assembly, went to go see their principal and were like, why are we using so much plastic in the cafeteria? And why are we still being served meat with all our lunches? And, they really started questioning a lot of things based on what they learned, but also felt empowered to go challenge, I think, some of the authority because of this process. So again, I think if we think about what are the ripple effects of involving children in this really meaningful way, I think it's really amazing. And then maybe just the very last bit related to the tech part, because I think there's a few different philosophies when thinking about how technology can be helpful. I personally, especially at a kind of more local level, don't think we should be trying to replace the in-person and the face-to-face and everything that comes with the benefits of doing that. And I think during the COVID period, we actually had quite a few natural examples that emerged, at least a few of the projects that I was involved in and that were going to be taking face-to-face. We had to adapt them to take place virtually during COVID times. And we found that it was, neither easier nor cheaper, required a lot more effort actually when we wanted to maintain that principle of this being a genuinely democratic process. So in one of the assemblies we did in Spain, 10 of the people selected by Sortition did not have a computer at home that they could use for this process. And I think like when we work in the fields we work in, we kind of take that for granted, that of course everyone has their computer. I spend my day on Zoom and so on, but a lot of people don't feel comfortable with this technology. Maybe they have one computer at home for their whole family and they couldn't just monopolize it for a process that they're involved in as well. A lot of people needed some support to be able to really participate virtually. And we had to set up a system with the local library where they could go use it and so on. I mean, there are ways around it. I do think there's an interest in exploring what can be done, especially when we get maybe to that national scale, when we think also about the climate implications of lots of travel in bigger places, and obviously, I guess, at a transnational, international level too. How can we think about it? But I think for me, I'm very mindful about really not losing the main principles in terms of, the sortition, the amount of time involved, not reducing that, but it obviously needs a different design. You're not going to spend 8 hours a day virtually connected the way you would for an 8-hour, maybe full day session in person where you have the energy to do that. So, so I think that's kind of the way I'm thinking about technology in this, because I think there's still a huge value, especially when we're concerned about those deeper issues around people's sense of trust, also their like belonging and sense of community and strengthening their agency and so on. I think that all of that is a lot harder to achieve when we're moving to a purely virtual kind of setting too. So I think I'll leave it there on some other comments.
Thank you, Claudia. We'll move to questions and answers, and would invite you to raise your hands and ask your questions verbally. But I did want to see if I can get a few responses from a civil servant. There's some who are kind of converted. MCCY, MOM have done this, but I really was curious about URA. Pin Xuan Yui, if you are willing to speak up. You don't have to represent the views of the URA, likely you can't, but I was just wondering if let's say you brought, citizens' assemblies for urban planning sound really cool. If that idea was put to your agency, what do you think the considerations would be?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for asking. Actually, we just concluded a engagement session on Tuesday regarding the Long Island, the conceptualization of Long Island. citizen assemblies. I think they're a good idea, but the main concern would probably be like the manpower and the logistics. Okay, so maybe I can just share a bit. Like we've done 4 of these Long Island engagements to date this year, and each was a huge event for us. It took about a month each to get everything ready before we could execute the actual event. And the actual event only lasted like maybe 4 hours in the evening. Yeah. So that was it's pretty challenging in the sense that it's quite a large logistical effort. But yeah, we do value the insights we can gather from the members of public. Actually, this idea of sortition, it's my first time hearing about it today. We've been trying to do something like that, but we didn't know that there's such a word for it. Yeah, we've been sending out email invites to I think very, very broad, very broad list of members of public. We try specifically to find people that are perhaps underrepresented. But from our observation, even though we try to engage some people that are harder to reach, some of them are still unresponsive to us. And the final outcome at our engagement sessions is such that we do end up with those that are more vocal, more articulate, more involved in the democratic process, which is why I'm here to learn. Actually, we're trying to learn about how to be more effective in our outreach. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Does anyone have questions? Just raise your hand.
Justin, I'm just wondering, since Yiling is in the room,
I thought she was, but then
yeah, she is.
She is. Hi.
Yeah,
Yiling,
hi Yiling. Just
Hi,
wondering.
hi.
Yeah, hi. Just wondering if
Hello.
you have any thoughts on what has been discussed so far.
Yeah, happy to share my thoughts, and actually thanks for inviting me. I just want to say that the sharing and the discussion, particularly around how do we ensure that the right people are in the room, I thought was illuminating. A lot of what you shared, Carol, resonated with me. I agree with a lot of the points. I just have 2 to add around what are the enabling conditions for this sort of engagement to blossom, and for us to do a lot more of these sort of in-depth engagement. I think the first is our conception of what the responsibilities of citizenship entail. So today we are very comfortable with the concept that as a citizen, it is your duty to vote. And this is a big deal, right? That if you don't vote, in fact, you're taken off the register, and everybody knows that as a citizen, it's a privilege, and you take it very seriously. I see the sortition concept as a possible extension of that. Do we also feel that it should also be seen as citizenship responsibility for people to participate if they are selected, and the logic behind that, the reason why we might have to come up very strongly to say this would be, we want to avoid tyranny of the people who are the most vocal, the most articulate, right? The question of how do we avoid over-engagement of some groups and under-engagement of other groups is something that I think would occupy our thinking, in the years to come, as we think about how do we deepen partnerships with the citizenry. So that's one, which is do citizens think of this as part of their duty? The second thing is really what does strength and what does leadership look like to society? I think where we are now, where Singapore is now, we have come a long way. And it really has got to do with the evolution of what the key ingredients of trust are. And what does strength, what does good leadership look like? I think in the past, when the general education level was much lower, strength and good leadership looked like leading from the front, exercising thought leadership, setting the agenda, right? But increasingly, as people are becoming more educated, they no longer see good leadership as, you know, simply setting the path forward. Good leadership looks a lot more like a facilitative process, enabling people to find a way rather than, you know, direct the path, direct the way forward. So I think that is a critical ingredient for any government, really, to grapple with the fear of loss of control. I think it comes with the territory. In order to engage meaningfully, sincerely, you must seek control. And governments would be willing to do that to the extent that good leadership doesn't necessarily look like keeping a very tight rein on control, but it in fact looks like facilitation, looks like enabling other people to find their own way. Something that I'd be interested in going forward is how can we be more of a democracy of deeds? You know, one of our founding fathers, S. Rajaratnam, spoke about democracy of deeds, that we should be a people that seek to be involved not just in words and ideas, but in taking ownership of the issue and thinking of ourselves as very much part of the solution. So how do we move from a situation where, you know, various different voices in society are clamoring to be heard, and ultimately think of government as the one party to sort of execute the wishes of the people? How can they think of themselves as being in the driver's seat and, you know, take charge of the issue, see themselves as part of the solution, and organize themselves, right? Organize themselves to make recommendations, put them forth to government. I think if we see more of that, we would achieve greater citizen participation without necessarily having government initiated all the time, and that would also help us to overcome some of the resourcing issues that have been raised. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have questions for our speakers or discussants? If not, I could ask one. I was curious, maybe have Claudia and Swarna weigh in on it. One of the ways to make a collective decision is either a kind of majority voting, and that if you reach 75 or 80%, that's great. But then Swarna's model from sociocracy is to use consent, which means it seems to be suitable only for a smaller circle where an idea that's proposed can be tweaked and amended until there's no objection. So I wondered whether it is by the nature of where citizens' assemblies are large that necessarily you have to have voting. And voting necessarily means that a smaller voice would be unhappy for the duration where the decision stands, and whether then this decision making by consent will necessarily have limits or its ability to scale. I wonder how you thought about this.
Yeah, I can jump in and then would love to hear what Swarna thinks as well about this. But I think that's a really excellent question. And it's one of those debates that kind of comes up actually in the field a little bit about what is that relationship actually between deliberation and voting as well, which I think has been underexplored in some ways, given that it's actually quite crucial, because even within a deliberative process, sometimes there's moments of voting that get designed in along the way, but that actually has an influence if you do it too early in terms of setting certain people's views and so on. But I think you're kind of, at least the way I see it, spot on hitting on that trade-off when it comes to the size of the group, because I think once you surpass a certain size, it's not really possible to be voting or taking decisions in the end by consent, because, you know, if you have 100 people in a room, that's already too big, I think, for people to really get to a point of being able to get to decision making that way. Then there's obviously different types of voting mechanisms, so, you know, with different trade-offs for how you do it and what's the right threshold, and there's also the trade-offs involved with, do you do those votes privately or publicly? And, you know, I think in the deliberation, though, we need to keep in mind that this is also in the context of what is often a lengthy process. So some of the examples that I mentioned, took place over 12 days of deliberation on 10 months. The last French Citizens' Assembly on end-of-life issues where I live now, it took place over 27 days of deliberation over the course of 4 months. So after you've already had that much time deliberating, by the time you get to a vote, though, it's different than if you had only had 1 day of deliberation and then you vote on the thing too. So, usually by the end, it's not a surprise of what people have really worked towards to get to that. And the vote is almost like a bit of a check of, okay, is there anyone that has been silently consenting away or so on? So, and that's also why you often get to those very high levels of thresholds of people being supportive, because you're also not asking people to say, you have to 100% agree, but you have to be comfortable with saying, okay, I can live with this. And some of the most interesting reflections are the conversations or hearing from the people who, maybe were not fully aligned personally with the outcome. So for example, there was a really powerful interview on a French kind of evening talk show with one of the members of that Citizens' Assembly on end-of-life issues, where she personally, from the very beginning and throughout and at the end, for religious reasons, was very against any liberalization of euthanasia and assisted dying elements that were in those proposals. It was just one of the sets of recommendations out of 67 things, just to give a sense of context and the depth, but she was explaining why she nonetheless voted in favor of those changes to the law. And it was because she felt heard in the process, and she wasn't judged, and she also really came to understand and hear and listen to what other people who held really the other view and understand better their reasons for why they believed in these things. So I think it's also the elements of the process itself that then lend themselves to that being possible to reach those thresholds. So yeah, I think I'll.
Thanks, Claudia. How about Swarna? What do you think? There seems to be a federated system in India for the Children's Parliament, small circles making decisions. Can those decisions actually percolate upwards totally via consent, or do you all sometimes use voting along the way?
It is excuse me, it is mainly by consent, and we usually use even voting based on consent. So for example, when we consent to a decision, and then like maybe we wouldn't have, and then we would go in small circles for kind of like reasons, and that's why we keep the circles pretty small, so that you can have some reasons, and then based on the reasons you have the ability to change your vote, and that again helps you to stick to the process of consent. So that sort of helps. And with regard to questions that came up on what are the other tools and mechanisms that we use, that sociocracy provides us to make decisions based on consent, and with regard to balancing the power between the adults and children, I would say rounds. We would go in rounds because the circles are pretty small, of about 25 to 30. Then what we do is we go in rounds and we try to ask each. Of course, it slightly delays the decision making. That limitation is certainly there, but because of that delay, it's also pretty good that there is a representative system. So that's why we also elect representatives for different portfolios. For example, with regard to Children's Parliament, we have ministers for various concerns like health, environment, education, and recently we've also shifted to the sustainable development goals. And therefore, the moment we elect those representatives, then we ultimately trust them to kind of make decisions for the circle. So they will be making decisions in their department. So that advantage is also there, to be able to follow the consent process. And so with regard to the mechanisms, rounds is a mechanism where we try to ask each person in a round to ensure that they are heard. And second is, as I told you, both and thinking is yet another mechanism that if there are many people in the room, we then try to divide them into a few circles and then like basically listen from them what opinions that they have and try to incorporate them. For example, at one point we had a debate in the World Children's Parliament, that children always require, it's not just children, I would say everybody, like all of us, require a sort of, playful mechanism to kind of take things within us. And with regard to our meetings, we were convening. That's why we usually used to convene our meetings with icebreakers. And as we were doing that, at one point we realized that that's time consuming. And therefore, sociocracy also offers a tool of having check-ins and closing round comments. In check-ins, you can share how you are or what you're feeling at present moment and all those. And in the closing round, you can share how did the meeting go, what went well, and what could have gone better. And during the check-in, we decided that, well, icebreaker is time consuming along with the check-in process. So what do we do? And so a thought came. Imagine that if it's another decision of a voting mechanism, we would have thought whether to have icebreaker or not. So whoever says no icebreaker, then we would have left the icebreaker. Maybe let's say the majority says no icebreaker, and then we would have left the icebreaker. But in sociocracy, we incorporated the decision. We said, okay, somebody says no icebreaker and somebody says we need, and we validated the reasons, and then we said, why don't we incorporate the icebreaker in the check-in round itself? And we try to say that it's a virtual world as well. That's, I forgot to mention you the context, that it was a virtual meeting. And so in-person meetings, we usually used to have a lot of methods to kind of cheer each other, play. But in the virtual world, it was very hard to be inclusive and as well as to have these kind of icebreakers. So we decided that we incorporate that with the check-ins round itself, and that was less time consuming, and as well as we did include the icebreaker. So that's kind of an advantage of sociocracy.
Thanks, Shwana. That's really interesting. It almost feels like voting, especially if it's done prematurely, holds off a possible creative workaround or solution. So that's really cool. We are at time, but I would like to leave, maybe have everyone give a takeaway reflection from today. Maybe we'll start with Xiaoling and Yiling and Carol and Claudia, then Shwana. What's your takeaway from the session, Xiaoling?
Thanks, Justin. I'll keep it really short. I think the takeaways I've really shared just now. So I thought the next step is to learn more from Claudia and Swana. So I'm just going to link up with them and have separate conversations, because I think really there's a lot to unpack from the processes that they have described in this session. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you so much. Yiling, do you have any parting words for us?
Yeah, no, lots of food for thought. I'm grateful for today's session. I think it leads me to think that really we've only just scratched the surface, and there's so many more modalities and innovations in citizen engagement yet to be explored. So yeah, thankful for this session.
Thank you. Over to you, Carol.
Yes, a lot of possibilities, especially with technology. Agree with Claudia. Definitely, we need to look at how technology can complement ongoing engagement, certainly not supplant entirely, but really exciting too, because there's lots of unknowns when it comes to these developments. So really looking forward to hopefully more collaborations to come up with answers and evidence-based strategies to improve the process for everybody.
Thanks, Carol. Parting reflections from Claudia?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I learned a lot from all of the speakers. I also, maybe just to reiterate, I really appreciate actually Yiling's points about citizenship and that dual side of like the responsibility and the privilege, and sortition being an extension of the privilege around voting, but also that questioning about what does leadership really mean and look like today. This is also something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I appreciated her bringing that up in this meeting today. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Learn a lot from you too, Claudia. Thank you.
Shwana, you have the last word.
I really enjoyed hearing all the speakers here, and I'm really humbled by all the presentations given, and I had a lot of takeaways, of course, from what Claudia and other presenters did. Especially, I could remember one of the presenters saying that, pointing out the power, the balance of power between the adults and children, because that's really something that I've also been thinking about, that no matter what we say, that imbalance exists. And so, so I was just lingering on that. And then I was also really admiring when Claudia was just able to say that whether we are able to live with it, I'm sure no other word could better describe that the process. So I really appreciated and sort of like enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Swarna. And thank you to all our participants. This has been brought to you by ToteBot, LKYCIC, and IPS, and we hope to see you at the next learning journey. Have a good evening, everybody.
Hi, sorry, just to...
Yeah, hi.
Sorry, can I ask, will we have access to the slides?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Because I need to digest a bit more. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.